Classrooms are meant to be sanctuaries of learning, where trust between teacher and student becomes the foundation for growth. But history tells us that sometimes, behind the calm voice of authority and the chalk dust rising from blackboards, darker truths lurk. These are the stories of teachers who betrayed their sacred role, educators who replaced lessons with manipulation, guidance with cruelty, and discipline with something far more sinister. In these tales, innocence was shattered, families were destroyed, and entire communities were left to grapple with the haunting reality that the very people entrusted to shape the future had instead left behind scars that time has yet to erase. This is not just a documentary about crime. It is a reckoning with the shadows that sometimes grow in the very places we believe ourselves to be safest. From the outside, John Whitaker was the embodiment of the respectable small-town teacher. He taught chemistry at Maplewood High, a quiet suburban school in Ohio, and was regarded by his peers as brilliant, though a little eccentric. He wore neatly pressed shirts, spoke in precise sentences, and carried himself with the air of someone who believed in rules, formulas, and order. Students described him as strict but fair, a teacher who expected excellence and didn't tolerate excuses. Parents trusted him, believing he was preparing their children for futures in science or medicine. But what none of them realized was that behind his meticulously maintained composure, Whitaker harbored obsessions far darker than any chemical experiment he taught in class. His classroom was not just a place of learning. It became a stage where he orchestrated control, manipulation, and ultimately violence that would leave a permanent scar in his community. NTHE unraveling began in 2009, when a series of small but strange incidents started to plague Maplewood High. Students reported that their lockers were being broken into, with personal items missing, not money or electronics, but oddly specific things: hairbrushes, pens, water bottles, even used tissues. At first, school administrators dismissed these as pranks or minor thefts, but the pattern grew too distinct to ignore. The missing objects all belonged to students from Whitaker's chemistry classes. Even stranger, many of the students began receiving anonymous notes written on lined paper in tidy block letters, quoting scientific phrases like, "All matter is preserved, but you must choose how to transform." Some notes included drawings of chemical structures, while others contained unnerving messages like, "You are an experiment worth saving." It was sophomore Jessica Reed who first grew suspicious. She noticed that the handwriting on one of the anonymous notes bore a striking resemblance to the neat formulas Whitaker often wrote on the board. Jessica confided in her parents, who took the matter to the school administration. But Whitaker was a well-liked staff member, and the principal dismissed the claim, suggesting Jessica might be trying to avoid his rigorous coursework. Months later, Jessica vanished. She had been last seen leaving school after attending one of Whitaker's evening tutoring sessions. Her disappearance sparked panic in Maplewood. Parents who had once trusted the school began demanding answers, while investigators scoured the campus for clues. But Whitaker was quick to provide an alibi, claiming Jessica had left early, upset about a poor grade, and had walked home alone. Without evidence, police couldn't tie him to her disappearance. The investigation dragged on, but nothing surfaced. Then, a year later, tragedy struck again. Another of Whitaker's students, 16-year-old Daniel Harris, went missing after staying late in the science lab. His backpack and bike were found outside the school, but he was never seen again. This time, suspicion among parents grew louder. Many noted that both missing students had been members of Whitaker's honors chemistry class. Still, Whitaker maintained his innocence, playing the role of a devastated teacher who had, quote, lost two bright young minds. He even volunteered to help in search efforts, all while maintaining his spotless professional record. It wasn't until 2012 that the truth began to emerge. A janitor at Maplewood High, while cleaning out an old storage room near the science labs, stumbled upon a locked cabinet. Inside were dozens of labeled jars containing hair, fingernail clippings, and scraps of fabric sealed in airtight conditions. There were also notebooks filled with disturbing entries that read less like lesson plans and more like laboratory observations. Subject J demonstrates high emotional volatility. Response to stimuli is extreme. Control measures must be increased. Another entry read, Subject D resists conditioning, but shows signs of surrender when isolated. The initials, investigators realized, matched Jessica Reed and Daniel Harris, and police immediately focused on Whitaker, who was arrested during one of his morning classes. As detectives searched his home, the horrors multiplied. In the basement, they discovered a hidden room designed like a laboratory, complete with restraints bolted into the floor. Chemical equipment lined the walls, not for teaching but for experimentation. On a table were personal items belonging to both missing students, the same items their families had reported stolen years earlier. The most chilling discovery was a series of videotapes in which Whitaker had recorded sessions with his victims. In these tapes, Jessica and Daniel appeared frightened, pleading to be released, while Whitaker, off camera, spoke in his calm lecturing tone. He treated them as test subjects rather than human beings, asking questions about their fears and pain as if recording scientific data. During his trial, prosecutors painted Whitaker as a sadistic manipulator who had weaponized his position as a teacher to prey upon his students. They revealed how he carefully selected vulnerable teenagers, those with family troubles, social isolation, or academic pressure, and lured them into staying after school with promises of extra help. Once he had them alone, he drugged them using chemicals easily accessible from the school lab. His obsession was not sexual in nature, but rather rooted in control and experimentation. He saw his students as specimens to be dissected emotionally and psychologically, convinced he was unlocking secrets about human resilience. And former students came forward to testify about his unnerving behavior. Several recalled how he would linger after class, asking strange personal questions about their home lives or emotions. One student described how he once told her, "You can be broken down into elements, but the way you recombine determines your worth." At the time, she thought it was a metaphor for chemistry. Looking back, she realized it was something far darker, 10. The jury didn't take long to convict Whitaker. He was sentenced to life without parole. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, he maintained an eerie composure. "I didn't kill them," he said in court. "I transformed them. They became part of something greater." His words sent shivers through everyone in attendance, particularly the families of Jessica and Daniel, whose bodies were never recovered. Investigators believe he may have disposed of them using corrosive chemicals in his lab, erasing all physical traces. NTHE case left Maplewood High shattered. Parents pulled their children from the school, demanding answers about how such a predator had been allowed to operate unchecked for years. Teachers who had once worked alongside Whitaker struggled with guilt, recalling moments they dismissed as harmless eccentricity. The principal, who had ignored Jessica's parents' concerns, resigned in disgrace. For the community, the idea that a beloved teacher had not only manipulated but systematically destroyed the lives of his students was almost too much to bear. And in the years since Whitaker's conviction, his story has been studied by criminologists as an example of the teacher-predator archetype, an individual who uses the trust inherent in their role to mask sadistic compulsions. His case has also become the subject of documentaries and crime podcasts, each attempting to unravel how such a seemingly respectable man could carry out such horrors in plain sight. For the families of Jessica Reed and Daniel Harris, however, no amount of analysis or exposure can ease the pain of not knowing what became of their children. What makes the story linger isn't just the brutality of Whitaker's actions, but the chilling way he framed them. In his notebooks, written in the same neat block letters he once used to teach chemistry, he described his victims not as names but as subjects, as if erasing their humanity altogether. One entry, dated just weeks before his arrest, summed up his philosophy. "The classroom is too small. My experiments must continue. Knowledge demands sacrifice." Those words, discovered years later, still haunt investigators who worked the case, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't lurk in shadows, but stand in the front of a classroom, lecturing about formulas while quietly rewriting the lives of the vulnerable forever. Iederon Hastemans. At first glance, Mrs. Lorraine Laurie Caldwell was the kind of teacher parents wanted for their children. Warm, enthusiastic, and endlessly patient. She taught English at a quiet private academy in New Hampshire, her classroom decorated with posters of Shakespeare quotes and shelves lined with well-worn novels. Students remembered her as the type who remembered birthdays, encouraged creativity, and invited shy kids to eat lunch in her room when they felt alone. Parents adored her. Colleagues admired her. She wasn't just a teacher. She was the sort of figure who gave the impression of being a second mother. NBUT behind that image was something far more sinister. Lori Caldwell was a woman living in layers of deception, with a mind that twisted nurturing into obsession and guidance into control. Her downfall would come not because she slipped in some spectacular cinematic way, but because she was too meticulous, too careful, and too determined to weave her students into her private world. What began as favoritism slowly unraveled into possession, and eventually into crimes so bizarre and calculated that investigators described them as something between ritual and punishment. And it started small. Caldwell developed a particular fondness for a student named Emily Turner, a quiet sophomore with a love of poetry. Emily came from a troubled home. Her parents were in the middle of a bitter divorce, and she often stayed late at school to avoid going home. Caldwell saw herself as Emily's protector, telling colleagues she didn't want to see another bright light extinguished by bad parents. She began inviting Emily to her house after school for tea, tutoring, and safe space discussions. No one thought much of it. Teachers often formed mentorships with students, but Caldwell's attachment deepened into something darker. She began monitoring Emily's life in ways that went far beyond teaching. She would coincidentally appear at the library where Emily studied, at the park where she jogged, even at the small cafe where she liked to read. When Emily posted online about feeling stressed, Caldwell would show up the next day with carefully written notes of encouragement, quoting lines of poetry that seemed to mirror Emily's exact state of mind. At first, Emily was touched by the attention, but it soon became suffocating. Caldwell expected constant updates, texts about where Emily was, who she was with, what she was thinking. When Emily didn't respond fast enough, Caldwell would send messages like, "Silence is betrayal, Emily. Don't drift away." And other students began to notice that Emily was singled out for special treatment. Caldwell praised her excessively in class, often comparing her to characters in literature who suffered nobly under the weight of the world. One day, she made Emily read a Sylvia Plath poem aloud, then said, in front of the class, "This girl understands pain better than anyone here. She is more real than the rest of you." The comment left Emily humiliated and isolated. It didn't stop there. Emily's friends recalled that she suddenly grew withdrawn, constantly checking her phone as if afraid of missing something. She confided in one classmate that Mrs. Caldwell seemed to know things she shouldn't, like the fact that Emily had once sneaked out late at night to meet a friend, something she had never told anyone. Truth would come out later. Caldwell had stolen Emily's house keys during one of her visits, made copies, and begun secretly entering her home. Investigators would later discover journals in Caldwell's possession, that contained detailed descriptions of Emily's bedroom, the way her clothes were folded, the titles stacked on her nightstand. In one entry, Caldwell had written, "She leaves the window slightly cracked at night. She dreams with her mouth open, whispering names I don't recognize. Who are they? Who else lives inside her?" In late 2015, Emily failed to show up for school. At first, her absence didn't alarm teachers. Students skipped sometimes, especially with her family stress. But when she missed 2 days in a row, her friends began to worry. Her mother reported her missing after finding her room in disarray. Clothes were scattered on the floor, her phone had been left behind, and her diary, something Emily never parted with, was gone. Investigators quickly interviewed staff and students. Caldwell's name surfaced almost immediately. Emily's classmates mentioned the teacher's intense favoritism, and one student recalled hearing Caldwell say to Emily just days before she vanished, "You don't belong in that house anymore. I can take you where you'll be safe." When police questioned Caldwell, she presented herself as the concerned mentor. She claimed she hadn't seen Emily in days and suggested Emily might have run away due to her unstable home life. But detectives noted inconsistencies. Caldwell referred to Emily in the present tense with unnerving certainty, saying things like, "She's not gone. She's still here, still with us, just not in the way you think." Weeks into the investigation, police searched Caldwell's home. In her basement, they found what one detective would later describe as a shrine masquerading as a classroom. Desks were arranged in neat rows, each with notebooks open to blank pages. At the front of the room stood a chalkboard with lines of Emily's favorite poems written across it. But the most chilling discovery was a single desk, set apart, covered in Emily's belongings, her diary, her backpack, even strands of her hair tied with ribbons. And on the walls were photographs of Emily taken without her knowledge, walking to school, eating lunch, sitting by her bedroom window. Some photos had annotations in the margins, analyzing her expressions as if she were a character in a novel. One chilling note read, "She looks away when she lies. She bites her thumb when she thinks of me." In a locked cabinet, investigators found what they later described as evidence of psychological experiments. There were cassette tapes labeled with Emily's initials, each containing recordings of conversations between her and Caldwell. On the tapes, Caldwell's voice was soft, coaxing. "They don't understand you, Emily. Only I do. I'm the only one who can keep you whole." Emily's responses were filled with fear, at times pleading, at times silent. The most damning piece of evidence was a videotape marked simply "Final Lesson." In it, Emily appeared gaunt, sitting at the front of the makeshift classroom while Caldwell lectured to her as if she were the only student in existence. At one point, Emily sobbed and asked to go home. Caldwell responded calmly, "You are home. This is where you were always meant to be. Out there, they'll tear you apart. But in here, you'll never be lost." Emily's body was never found. Caldwell was arrested and charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and evidence tampering. During the trial, she refused to admit guilt, instead delivering long, rambling monologues about saving her students from the corruption of the outside world. She referred to Emily not as a victim, but as a chosen pupil who had transcended beyond what ordinary life could offer. Former students came forward with their own unsettling memories. One recalled how Caldwell would sometimes lock the classroom door during lunch and tell stories about other worlds where students could escape if they trusted her completely. Another revealed that Caldwell had once given her a bracelet and whispered, "Now you're bound to me. Don't take it off." Prosecutors argued that Caldwell's obsession escalated into abduction and murder, though without a body. The defense pushed for a lesser charge. In the end, she was convicted of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, receiving a life sentence without parole. Yet the trial brought no closure to Emily's family. Without a body, they could not bury their daughter. All they had were the eerie remnants of Caldwell's shrine. The stolen diary pages filled with Emily's words, and the knowledge that their child's last days had been spent under the suffocating control of someone she once trusted. NTHE case shocked the nation. News outlets dubbed Caldwell the classroom collector, a teacher who blurred the lines between mentorship and possession until she consumed her students entirely. Experts compared her behavior to cult leaders, noting how she isolated her victims, rewrote their sense of identity, and convinced them that she alone held the key to their safety. At Maplewood Academy, Caldwell's classroom remained sealed for months after her arrest. When staff finally entered to clear it out, they found something chilling. Hidden in the bottom drawer of her desk was a list of other students' names, each accompanied by notes like "too strong-willed," "family interference," and "potential candidate." It seemed Emily had not been her first choice, only the first she succeeded in fully ensnaring. NTO this day, Emily Turner's body has never been recovered. Some believe Caldwell buried her in the dense woods near her home, others that she used her access to chemicals to dispose of her remains. Whatever the truth, the mystery lingers. Parents who once trusted teachers implicitly now looked at them with suspicion, wondering what secrets might lie behind kind smiles and encouraging words. NTHE chilling detail that haunts many isn't just that Caldwell abducted Emily, it's that she seemed to believe she had done something good. In her final statement to the court, she looked directly at Emily's parents and said, She isn't gone. She's safe where you can't touch her. I gave her freedom you never could." NHER words echoed like a curse, leaving the courtroom in silence. Mr. Alan Whitaker had the kind of reputation that made parents feel safe sending their children to his classroom. He was steady, soft-spoken, and always seemed in control of himself, never raising his voice, never losing his temper. To the outside world, he was the archetype of a small-town science teacher in Indiana, a man with neatly combed hair, pressed shirts, and a fondness for long-winded lectures about chemistry and the wonders of the natural world. Students described him as boring but harmless, the kind of teacher who droned on but never scared or humiliated anyone. He taught at Roosevelt High for over 2 decades, long enough to see generations of students come and go, long enough for people to stop questioning who he really was. But beneath the mask of quiet respectability, Whitaker carried something dark, a private obsession that would eventually be tied to one of the most unsettling crime sprees in the region's history. NTHE first hints that something was wrong with Whitaker came in whispers, the kind that seemed too absurd to take seriously. A few students joked that he was too interested in his science fair projects, that he lingered too long when helping girls adjust their goggles, that he kept certain students after class for reasons that didn't quite make sense. But because Whitaker was unassuming and outwardly mild, those rumors never stuck. Parents liked him, colleagues described him as reliable, and even principals admitted he was the kind of teacher who never caused disciplinary trouble. What nobody knew was that Whitaker kept detailed notes on his students, notes that would later be described by investigators as a mixture of psychological profiles and surveillance reports. NTHE notes were discovered years later, after his arrest, in neatly labeled binders stacked in the basement of his home. Each binder was marked by year, then divided into sections by student name. Inside, there were pages filled with his observations. Tiffany, lonely, seeks approval from peers. Vulnerable to praise. Mark, rebellious, won't conform, not a candidate. Sarah walks home alone most days. Sits by the window in class. Ideal subject. What chilled investigators was the precision, the methodical way he had recorded not only their academic strengths and weaknesses, but their emotional vulnerabilities, their daily habits, their schedules. It wasn't just grading papers, it was surveillance. In 2003, the small town where Whitaker lived was shaken by the disappearance of a 16-year-old student named Sarah Collins. She was last seen leaving school one rainy afternoon, her backpack slung over her shoulder as she walked down the long road toward her house. When she never arrived, her parents called police. A search began immediately, and the community rallied. Posters went up, volunteers combed the woods, neighbors left porch lights on in case she found her way back. But Sarah never did. For weeks, her absence haunted the town, and suspicion turned briefly toward strangers, drifters, anyone who didn't belong. Nobody looked at Whitaker. It wasn't until 2008, when another girl, Emily Harper, vanished under nearly identical circumstances, that police began to consider the possibility of a pattern. Emily, too, had been one of Whitaker's students. She, too, had been walking home from school when she disappeared. At first, investigators chalked it up to coincidence. After all, teachers interacted with hundreds of students, but when they revisited both cases, certain unsettling overlaps emerged. Both Sarah and Emily had been part of Whitaker's after-school science club. Both had confided in friends that Whitaker seemed too invested in their personal lives, asking them questions about their families and their feelings in ways that felt intrusive. One girl recalled that Whitaker had once told Sarah she was a rare mind wasted in this town. NBY then, whispers began to grow louder. Some students recalled seeing Sarah enter Whitaker's classroom after hours, long after most staff had gone home. Others admitted they'd noticed him watching her more closely than other students, praising her in ways that felt uncomfortable. Still, without evidence, police couldn't act. Whitaker carried on with his career, teaching, grading, attending staff meetings, as if nothing were wrong. NTHE breakthrough came not from a dramatic confession or a lucky witness, but from an accident. In 2011, Whitaker's neighbor reported a strange smell coming from his garage. When authorities arrived, they discovered chemical containers and equipment that, while not illegal, were unusual for a high school teacher to keep at home in such quantities. This discovery led to a broader search of his property, which revealed a hidden crawl space beneath his basement. Inside, investigators found binders, photographs, personal belongings of missing girls, including Sarah's necklace and Emily's journal, and audio recordings labeled with their initials. On the tapes, Whitaker's voice was calm, almost soothing, as he spoke to the girls in what sounded like interviews. He asked them about their fears, their hopes, their secrets. "Do you feel understood?" he would ask. "Do you think your parents really see you?" At times, the girls sounded confused, hesitant. In one chilling recording, believed to be Sarah's, she asks to go home. Whitaker responds, in his usual measured tone, "Not yet. You're not ready. The world isn't ready for who you are." The tapes ended abruptly, with no sound of violence, no explanation of what came next, just silence. When the evidence was presented in court, the community was stunned. Whitaker maintained his innocence, insisting that the items were part of private experiments in psychology, that he had never harmed his students. He argued that the belongings found in his home had been gifts given willingly. But prosecutors painted a darker picture. A teacher who had exploited his position of trust, who had groomed vulnerable students, abducted them, and then erased their existence. Without the girls' bodies, the trial was complicated. The defense pushed back, insisting that no physical evidence tied Whitaker directly to the disappearances. But the jury could not ignore the chilling detail of the binders, the recordings, the personal items no teacher should have possessed. In 2013, Alan Whitaker was convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and possession of evidence related to missing persons. He was sentenced to life without parole, yet even after his conviction, the story didn't end. Forensic experts later combed through his binders and discovered references to other names, students who had never been reported missing but who had, in retrospect, experienced strange encounters with him. Some came forward, describing how he had once cornered them after class, asking questions that felt more like interrogations. One recalled him saying, "You could be more if only someone taught you properly." NTHE chilling thought that emerged was that Sarah and Emily might not have been his only victims, only the ones who were never found. The full extent of his obsession may never be known. NTHE case of Alan Whitaker continues to haunt investigators for one simple reason. Even with all the evidence, even with his conviction, the bodies of Sarah Collins and Emily Harper were never recovered. Their families remain in limbo, unable to bury their daughters, left with only binders full of cold notes and eerie recordings. One detective summed it up best. He taught for 20 years. We'll never know how many of his students never truly left his classroom. Mrs. Linda Caro was not the kind of teacher anyone suspected of hiding secrets. To her peers, she was a dependable English teacher at a mid-sized high school in Ohio, the kind who taught Shakespeare with a kind smile and always volunteered for after-school programs. Parents described her as nurturing, a figure who took her students under her wing. She was known for staying late to help kids struggling with essays, or for slipping encouraging notes into the margins of their papers. Yet beneath her kindly exterior was a streak of control, a desire not only to teach her students but to mold them, to shape their lives in ways that blurred the line between mentorship and obsession. It was this compulsion, quiet at first, that led her down a path of secrecy and ultimately into one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in the town's history. NTHE first signs appeared in her classroom itself. Students noticed that she would latch onto certain individuals each year, showering them with extra attention while ignoring others. She offered her favorites, free tutoring sessions, weekend meetups disguised as study groups, and private excursions to libraries or bookstores. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Parents were glad their children had a teacher so invested in their academic success. But over time, patterns began to emerge. Those students she focused on often came from unstable homes, or they were shy, lonely, and eager for adult approval. They were the kind of children who could easily be swayed by an authority figure who promised safety and recognition. In 2001, a junior named Megan Lawson disappeared after leaving one of Mrs. Caro's weekend study groups. She was last seen stepping out of the school library on a rainy Saturday evening, her backpack slung over one shoulder, telling friends she was heading home. She never arrived. At first, her disappearance seemed like another tragic runaway case. Megan's parents were divorced, her home life difficult. Police speculated that she had fled, though friends insisted she was excited about an upcoming scholarship opportunity and wouldn't have vanished voluntarily. Mrs. Caro was interviewed briefly, as she had been the last adult to see Megan that day, but she claimed Megan left at dusk and that was the end of it. The community moved on, but Megan's case remained cold, a hollow absence that haunted the school's halls. Then, 3 years later, another student disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. Jessica Monroe, a quiet sophomore, was known for staying after class with Mrs. Caro. She told her parents she had an extra tutoring session on a Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, she was gone. This time, suspicion briefly returned to Caro, but her calm, cooperative demeanor disarmed investigators. She explained that Jessica had shown up, seemed distracted, then left early. Again, police could not link her directly to the disappearance. Whispers spread among students, though. They said Mrs. Caro kept a special drawer in her classroom desk, filled with personal letters, trinkets, and journals given to her by students she favored. They remembered how she asked deeply personal questions, far beyond academics. Did they feel understood at home? Did they trust their parents? Did they ever feel like disappearing? For some, these conversations felt caring. For others, they seemed invasive. But teenagers are quick to gossip and quick to dismiss. Most assumed their teacher was simply quirky, maybe lonely. What nobody realized until later was that Mrs. Caro had begun keeping meticulous journals of her own. When she finally became the subject of a deeper investigation in 2010, after the disappearance of a third girl named Allison Reeves, police discovered dozens of notebooks hidden in her attic. Each one was devoted to a particular student. The entries were detailed, obsessive, and unnerving. Megan needs someone to guide her. Her parents are blind to her potential. One entry read, "Jessica craves attention but hides behind silence. She must learn to open herself, and I can help her." In Allison's journal, investigators found a chilling line written just 2 weeks before her disappearance. "Allison is ready for the next step. She trusts me completely." And inside the notebooks were also taped Polaroids, candid shots of students taken at school, at football games, walking down hallways, pictures none of the teenagers had ever known were taken. Alongside the photographs were pieces of their handwriting, ripped from old essays or homework, as though Caro wanted to preserve pieces of them forever. The evidence painted the picture of a woman who wasn't just teaching. She was collecting her students piece by piece, shaping their narratives as if they belonged to her. Despite these discoveries, the most crucial evidence was still missing: the students themselves. Megan, Jessica, and Allison were never found. Without bodies or direct physical proof tying Caro to their disappearances, prosecutors struggled to build a case. Caro herself, when confronted, was eerily composed. She told detectives that she cared deeply for her students, that her notes were the work of a dedicated teacher, and that if the girls were missing, it had nothing to do with her. To some investigators, her calmness was unnerving, a mask too perfect. Over the following months, as her trial loomed, disturbing details emerged from her past. A former student, now in his 20s, came forward and recalled that she once kept him after class and told him, "You don't have to go home tonight if you don't want to. I can take care of you." Another remembered waking up at a weekend study retreat she had organized to find her sitting at the edge of his bed, watching him. These testimonies, while unsettling, were not enough to secure a conviction in the disappearances. And Caro was eventually convicted only on charges of obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence, stemming from her deliberate destruction of certain notebooks and tapes before police could seize them. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Yet for the families of the missing girls, justice was incomplete. They wanted answers, they wanted to know where their daughters were, and Caro never provided them. She maintained her innocence until the end, repeating that she had nothing to do with what happened, and that her notebooks were misinterpreted. Even in prison, she became an enigma. Guards reported that she continued to keep journals, this time about her fellow inmates, writing down their habits and personalities as though they were her students. She taught GED classes to women behind bars, earning their trust, becoming a figure of strange authority once again. Some inmates swore she would sit and stare at them with that same calm expression, the same patience that unsettled her former students. When she died in 2019 from a sudden illness, her cell was searched. In a box beneath her bunk, Authorities found more notebooks, new ones filled with entries about the missing girls. One line stood out: "They will never be found." That is the gift I gave them. Freedom from a world that never saw them. NFOR. The families of Megan, Jessica, and Allison. It was both a confession and another cruelty. The words confirmed what they had always feared, yet denied them closure. To this day, their daughters remain missing, and Linda Caro's true actions, how she lured them, what she did with them, where they went, remain locked away forever. The case continues to haunt investigators, not because of what they know, but because of all they never uncovered. Mr. Daniel Harker's classroom was the kind of place students initially liked walking into. Posters of classic literature lined the walls. Old typewriters sat as display pieces on his shelves, and the smell of chalk dust and old books gave the room a sense of permanence, as if it belonged to another era. Harker, an English teacher in rural Pennsylvania, had a reputation for being brilliant and eccentric. He was the kind of teacher who could recite entire passages of Melville or Dickens by memory, the kind who took his students on outdoor reading walks through the woods, insisting that literature had to be lived, not just studied. Parents praised his passion, administrators admired his innovative teaching methods, and students, at least at first, felt lucky to be in his class. But what no one realized was that Harker's love for literature was more than an academic interest. It was a framework for his obsession, a script he would use to justify the increasingly sinister control he exerted over those around him. NTHE first hints came in the way he talked about books. To Harker, novels weren't just stories. They were blueprints for life. He told students that every person had a narrative arc, that some were destined for tragedy while others were chosen for greatness. It sounded poetic in the classroom, even inspiring. But privately, he began telling select students that he could see their story more clearly than they could. He identified loners, kids struggling with self-esteem or family problems, and whispered to them that they were destined for something greater or darker. To those he favored, it felt like validation from a mentor. To others, it was a seed of unease that grew over time. In 2005, one of his students, a 16-year-old named Kevin Armstrong, was found dead in the woods near the edge of town. At first, investigators believed it was a tragic accident. Kevin was discovered lying beside a creek, his wrists marked with strange symbols carved into the skin, and his copy of Moby Dick placed neatly beside him. The coroner ruled his death as suicide, but friends insisted Kevin had shown no signs of despair. More chilling was the fact that only weeks earlier, Harker had told his class that every great story requires sacrifice, and had discussed the theme of fate in Moby Dick with a fervor that unnerved some students. Rumors spread that Kevin had been singled out as one of Harker's chosen. NTHE whispers might have died with time, but then another student vanished the following year. Emily Rhodes, a shy junior who had often lingered after class to talk with Harker, disappeared after attending one of his infamous literary retreats. These retreats, hosted at his cabin in the woods, were supposedly designed to help advanced students immerse themselves in classic works. Emily's parents reluctantly allowed her to attend, convinced it was an opportunity for enrichment. She never came home. Harker told police she had left early, saying she felt unwell. When her car was later found abandoned on a dirt road leading out of the forest, suspicion deepened. The town was shaken, but there was no concrete evidence linking Harker to Emily's disappearance. He remained a respected teacher, though his reputation carried a darker undercurrent. Students began referring to him as the storyteller, half in awe and half in fear. Some said he kept a ledger filled with names of students and notes about how their stories would end. Others swore he recited passages from literature in a trance-like state, as if he believed he was orchestrating events himself. In 2008, another tragedy struck. A group of students attending a retreat reported hearing screams in the woods late at night. When they confronted Harker, he calmly told them it was just the forest telling its tale. Days later, the body of another teenager, 17-year-old Lucas Miller, was discovered in the same woods, his corpse arranged in a grotesque tableau that mirrored a scene from Lord of the Flies. Around him were scattered burned pages from the novel, as though someone had deliberately staged the scene. Investigators questioned Harker, who once again denied involvement. He admitted to assigning Lord of the Flies to his students, but dismissed any suggestion that he was connected to Lucas's death. Still, whispers turned into fearful gossip. Was Harker reenacting literature through the lives and deaths of his students? NBY now, investigators began to see a pattern. Kevin, Emily, and Lucas had all been close to Harker. Each tragedy bore literary symbolism, and in each case, Harker had delivered cryptic statements beforehand about destiny, sacrifice, or the role of characters in a larger story. Yet prosecutors lacked tangible proof. Without direct evidence, he continued teaching, his influence spreading in subtler, more disturbing ways. Then came the discovery of his journals. In 2011, a former student broke into Harker's cabin, driven by years of suspicion, and found stacks of notebooks filled with strange, obsessive writings. Each notebook bore the name of a student on its cover. Inside were detailed observations, fragments of conversations, and unnerving predictions. Kevin's end will come with water and words carved into his flesh. One entry read, written months before Kevin's body was found by the creek. Emily is fragile, but she must vanish to fulfill her arc. Another notebook ominously declared, Lucas will burn, as all leaders must. NTHE journals were turned over to police, but Harker claimed they were harmless creative exercises, ways of channeling his love for literature into mock stories. He argued that any overlap with real events was coincidence, or the result of his students being inspired by his teaching. It was a chilling defense, but again, investigators lacked the final link that could prove his guilt. In Inspira Fornana Futuris, as the years passed, Harker grew bolder. Students later testified that he began holding private story circles at his cabin, where he would demand they confess their darkest secrets, framing it as a way of understanding their character. Some recalled being made to reenact scenes from novels, standing in candlelit rooms as he whispered passages from Poe or Hawthorne. A few claimed he hinted that their stories could only be completed through death, though at the time they dismissed it as dramatic theatrics. NBY 2015, Harker abruptly resigned from teaching and disappeared from town. Some say he moved to a distant state under a new name. Others believe he never left the woods at all. His cabin was later found abandoned, its walls covered with quotes scrawled in chalk, fragments like, "The end is never the end," and quote, "Characters cannot escape their destiny." In a locked trunk, authorities discovered a final manuscript, an unfinished novel written in Harker's hand. The story followed a teacher who selected students to act out roles in a grand narrative, their lives and deaths dictated by the plot he devised. The novel ended mid-sentence with the words, "And so, the final chapter begins." NFOR investigators, the case remains unsolved, a nightmare of blurred lines between literature and reality. Some believe Harker killed at least 3 of his students, staging their deaths as part of his literary obsessions. Others argue he was a manipulator who planted ideas in vulnerable minds, leading them to tragic ends without ever lifting a hand. But one fact remains. 3 young lives were lost, 1 girl vanished forever, and the man at the center of it all slipped away, leaving only words in his wake. NTO this day, whenever detectives revisit the case, they describe it not only as frustrating, but haunting. They say they can still feel Harker's presence in the woods, like a character in a novel that refuses to end, his story unfinished, waiting for the next reader to turn the page. The last case in this series is perhaps the most unsettling of all, not because of the brutality involved, nor because of the evidence that was left behind, but because it embodies the kind of horror that investigators hate most. The sense that something happened right in front of everyone, that all the signs were there, and yet no one realized until it was too late. It took place in 1999 in a small coastal town in Oregon, where high school biology teacher Mrs. Evelyn Ward had been working for. She was known to everyone in town, respected by parents and loved by students. To many, she was the sort of teacher who seemed utterly devoted to her work, always present, always offering tutoring after class, always volunteering for extra duties. She was described as, quote, "the backbone of the school." Yet, beneath this carefully cultivated image, Evelyn Ward carried with her a hidden life, one that would slowly unfold across a series of deaths that remain unexplained to this day. It began with whispers among students. They noticed she seemed to play favorites, not in the usual sense of liking certain students more, but in how she would choose one student each year to mentor closely. She would insist they stay after class, often inviting them to her house for extra help. Some saw it as dedication, others felt something darker. Several students reported feeling uncomfortable with her intense gaze, the way she seemed to study them, not as people, but as specimens under a microscope. In the spring of 1999, a junior named Melissa Kane was found dead in her bedroom. Her death was ruled an accidental overdose at first. Empty pill bottles were scattered on the nightstand, and there was no sign of forced entry. But her friends later told police Melissa had been speaking strangely in the weeks leading up to her death. She told them Mrs. Ward had been teaching her things outside of class, lessons about poisons and chemicals that weren't in the curriculum. She claimed Ward had insisted that every scientist must know how to end life as well as preserve it. Her friends laughed it off, assuming Melissa was exaggerating. After her death, though, the words felt more like a confession no one had taken seriously. A year later, another student, Jason Lott, a quiet boy who spent most of his free time in the school lab, was found floating face down in a nearby marsh. His cause of death was listed as drowning, though his lungs contained unusual traces of chemicals more consistent with lab preservatives than pond water. Teachers recalled that Jason had been Ward's chosen student that year, often working late with her on, quote, special projects. His parents told investigators they had grown concerned about the way Ward inserted herself into his life, calling their home regularly, leaving messages about his potential and his destiny. But again, nothing concrete tied her to his death. By 2003, the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Every year or two, one of Ward's students died, always one she had taken under her wing. Sometimes the deaths were framed as accidents, sometimes as suicides, but always with strange details that didn't quite fit. A girl fell from the cliffs near the coast, her body discovered in a position eerily reminiscent of a biology diagram of a falling bird. A boy was found in the school's greenhouse, his veins filled with toxins used in horticulture experiments. Another was discovered in her garage, asphyxiated, though his family insisted he would never have been near that part of town. Rumors swirled that Ward was using her knowledge of science to orchestrate deaths she could easily disguise as misfortunes. Some believed she was conducting experiments, using her students as test subjects. Others whispered that she was reenacting case studies from obscure biology texts, turning real lives into grotesque demonstrations of scientific principles. And police eventually searched her home. What they found was disturbing, though not enough to press charges. In her basement were rows of notebooks, meticulously organized, each labeled with the name of a student she had mentored. Inside were notes about their personalities, habits, and weaknesses, interwoven with detailed biological diagrams and strange philosophical passages about the fragility of young life. Investigators also found jars containing preserved insects, small animals, and most unsettling, strands of human hair tagged with student names. When confronted, Ward dismissed it all as a misunderstood passion for teaching and biology. She claimed the hair samples had been collected with student permission as part of classroom experiments, and the notebooks were simply reflections on her students' progress. With no direct evidence tying her to the deaths, the case stalled. Parents demanded her removal from the school, but administrators hesitated. She was tenured, respected, and on paper, her record showed nothing that could justify termination. Then came the case that broke everything open, or should have. In 2007, a student named Hannah Pierce vanished after staying late for tutoring with Ward. She was last seen leaving the school with her teacher, but Ward insisted Hannah had decided to walk home alone. For weeks, search teams combed the woods and coastline, but no trace of Hannah was ever found. Her disappearance ignited the town's fears into open fury. Parents protested outside the school, demanding Ward's arrest. Yet, once again, there was no body, no proof. Ward was placed on leave but never charged. She quietly left town that same year. Over the next decade, investigators tried to track her. Some believe she had changed her name and resurfaced in another state. There were rumors of a new teacher in Washington who bore a striking resemblance to Ward, and whispers of unexplained student deaths there as well. Nothing, however, was confirmed. NTHE. True horror of the Evelyn Ward case lies not only in the deaths themselves, but in the way she seemed to manipulate her role as a teacher to conceal her crimes. Teachers are trusted figures, often closer to children than their own parents. Ward exploited that trust, positioning herself as both mentor and predator, using her knowledge of biology to mask her cruelty behind a veil of scientific inevitability. NTO this day. Investigators who worked the case speak of it with frustration and regret. They believe she killed at least 6 students, possibly more, each one chosen, studied, and ultimately disposed of under the guise of tragic accidents. The notebooks remain in police custody, and every so often, new detectives are assigned to comb through them, searching for patterns that might finally yield definitive proof. NBUT Ward herself is gone, vanished like a shadow slipping out of town. Whether she died quietly somewhere, assumed a new identity, or continues her lessons in another unsuspecting community is unknown. What is certain, however, is that the deaths of those children remain unsolved, their families left with only grief and unanswered questions. NTHE case haunts not only the investigators but the entire community. It is a chilling reminder of how easily evil can hide behind the mask of authority, how predators can wear the guise of protectors, and how some of the darkest lessons are not found in classrooms, but in the spaces where trust is betrayed.